It's clear that things like foreign influence and mis, dis, or malinformation are distinct challenges that sometimes overlap, but are often conflated. To solve for each will require unique approaches, as well as a more comprehensive understanding of how vulnerabilities intersect. The good news is that we know more, have more resources, and more expertise than before. The bad news, we still have much more work to do together. For our next session, we'll hear from Nathaniel Gleicher, who currently serves as the head of security policy at Facebook, in a conversation hosted by DFR Lab non-resident fellow Oumou Lee. Gleicher will discuss trends and lessons learned as one of the world's largest social media platforms has worked to curb influence operations online. Over to you, Oumou.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Graham. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Oumou, and welcome to this Day 3 Fireside Chat. One of the themes we've heard consistently today is how much the field dedicated to countering influence operations has expanded really over the last 4 years or so. And that expansion, to a large degree, has been underpinned by the practice of disclosing or sharing publicly what's known about how threat actors operate. In just a moment, you'll hear from Nathaniel Gleicher, who currently serves as the head of security policy at Facebook. Last month, Facebook released a multi-year assessment of influence operations, including trends and threats, vulnerabilities and manipulation, in addition to some of the lessons learned about how to combat these things on their platform. Nathaniel will present on that report and then take audience questions in the latter half of the session. And to quickly note, this is very much intended to be a conversation, so please send in questions using the Socio app. We will do our best to get to them after a brief presentation. And so with that, Nathaniel, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Oumou. And thanks everybody for having me. I'm glad to be here and looking forward to the conversation. What I wanted to do to start is to talk a little bit about the scope of my team, what we think about, to talk about some of the adversarial trends and some of the threats that we've seen that have developed over recent years, some of the lessons learned, some of the places where I think we had some success and some of the places where we can work better. And then also to talk about where things are going next, what we see. And to do this, as Oumou mentioned, I'm going to be drawing on a threat report that the team put out recently, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. One, my team coordinates our work across the company to find and stop adversarial threats. What I mean by that is any determined threat actor, whether an individual or a group, that is systemically working to manipulate public debate or directly target users across our platforms. As it will surprise no one to hear, one of the adversarial threats we've been particularly focused on is how to counter influence operations. This map shows the 150 plus CIB operations, and I'll define that in a minute, that we have found and publicly removed over the past several years, and that form the basis for this threat report. As we think about how all these pieces fit together, I want to talk about sort of what we learned and some of the lessons we can draw. But first, I just want to say the threat report is the result of the work of a broad team across the company. And I think it's important to call all of them out. A number of the people you see on the screen here are the primary authors. You're hearing from some of them at this conference, or we've actually already heard from some of them. And I know a number of people in the audience know them and know some of these different investigators. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to them and give them a hard time. There's also a broader threat intelligence team that drives our investigative work in this space. And without that sort of analysis and investigation, none of the public reporting would have been possible. To start, though, I think when we look at this report, one of the last pieces I actually wanted to mention is that there is actually attached to the back of it a data set of all of those 150 plus takedowns that I mentioned. And each takedown is accompanied with statistics, context, and a link to much deeper information. So if I raise anything in this conversation that you have questions about or that you want to dig into further, you can go there and take a look and understand more about what's there. To talk about this, one, I think, step back is important, which is to say, if we're talking about adversarial threats, influence operations are only one piece of the puzzle. My team tracks 4 different kinds of adversarial threats right now, and we're always talking about whether there are others that need to be added. Overt influence operations, so efforts to manipulate public debate done in one's own voice without trying to conceal your identity, for example, state media. Second, covert influence operations, where an individual or a group hides their identity in hopes of laundering that identity to make their message more effective. Cyber espionage, where we think about direct hacking or direct exploit of user accounts or user devices. And then frauds and scams, financially motivated actors looking to profit off of manipulation, misinformation, and clickbait. We talk a lot about state actors in this context and the importance of countering state operations, but I do think it's good to call out that the majority of deception that we see is actually driven by financially motivated actors. And the ways you disincentivize or counter financially motivated actors are likely going to be quite different than the ways you would disincentivize or counter political actors. I'm going to focus in this conversation on covert influence operations. And one of the reasons I'm going to do that, and one of the reasons why the report focused on this space, is not only is it an area where the actors are being particularly deceptive, but it is also the space where we have seen the most progress in terms of defensive coordination and response across society over the last few years. And as a result, we've seen some of the most aggressive adversarial adaptation to counter those defenses. And so at this moment, as we sort of look backwards and look forward and think about what's coming next, this is a really useful space to focus. If we're going to talk about influence operations, I want to start with a definition. And I'm going to focus you on this definition on the right side of the screen there, coordinated inauthentic behavior. This is a term that we've used since late 2017 and early 2018, and is now widely used across the community and across public debate to talk about influence operations. But the truth is it's used in a lot of different ways. So when I'm talking about it and when my team is thinking about it, we are thinking about it in an intentionally narrow and specific context. CIB is designed to capture some of the most egregious, persistent, and deceptive operations we see across the platform. Not all of them. It's actually intended to be a fairly small slice. And what we're looking for is operations that rely on coordinated groups of pages and accounts and other Facebook assets that are misleading people about who's behind the operation and that are centrally relying on fake accounts to do so. And I'll just call that out because all of the analysis here is built on our disruptions of these operations. And so this is where we are looking, and this is where the root of this analysis is. We obviously have teams and investigative capacity to tackle other types of threats. But one of the things we've learned is that many of the most sophisticated actors are the most creative in the context of CIB. And tactics and techniques they use trickle from CIB down to other types of threats that we see on the platform. And so focusing here helps us stay ahead of some of this adversarial innovation. I'm sure many of you have seen Camille Francois's actor behavior content framework, where she breaks up threats on social media platforms and in public debate more broadly into the actor who's behind it, the behavior they engage in, and the content they share. The only point that I will make here is that when we are conducting CIB investigations and enforcements, we're focused primarily on the behavior that's being displayed and to some degree on the actor. For example, if there is a repeat disinformer, there's a repeat influence operator, we might be looking at the actor who's behind it, but we're not actually analyzing the content to conduct the enforcement. We do share information about the content that's part of the operation. And the reason we do that is there is so much interest in what these operations are saying that I think it's important to disclose that. But in terms of enforcement, we focus on behavior and then we focus on actor. My last caveat here, this is a data set that we're drawing on. And I think it's important to always acknowledge that no data set is perfect. There are limitations to it. And so I wanted to call out a couple of them and talk about why I think this is a useful data set to be focused on. First, this data set is platform and violation specific. These are obviously operations that touch Facebook or Facebook platforms, and they are violations for CIB, not for everything. That narrows the scope of the data set. Second, our investigations prioritize critical events and important civic moments around the world. So we might focus more investigative resources ahead of a major election or ahead of a coup or another critical civic moment. That's obviously going to skew the data set a little bit, but it also means we're more likely to catch threat actors at the moment where they could cause some of the most harm. And finally, we're continually expanding our teams that tackle these threats and improving our detection frameworks. So as you look at the data set, you'll see that particularly as you get to more recent times, we are catching more operations and we're catching them earlier, and we're catching smaller operations. That obviously impacts the data set as well, but it's a sign of progress, and it's a sign that we're catching more of these. Despite those limitations, I actually think this is an incredibly valuable data set. And it's valuable because we really do see global scope here. This data set touches more than 50 countries, operations in more than 30 languages on every continent but Antarctica. And despite the fact that public debate around IO often focuses on the United States and Europe, one of the things that you'll see here is a very heavy representation of influence operations targeting or originating in countries beyond there, in the global south and elsewhere in the world. And I think that that's a really critical piece of tackling IO, is looking beyond just the US and the European context to the places where we're seeing renewed technique and ongoing innovation from these threat actors. When we look at this data set, you'll see that there are government and non-government operations, there are foreign operations and domestic operations. It reinforces the fact that influence operations really isn't one problem. There are many different types of threat actors, and the techniques we use to tackle them and the challenges they raise are distinct. And so I think it's really important as we think about tackling this space that we're precise about which piece of the puzzle we want to tackle. And this raises a statistical point I want to draw from the report that I think is really interesting. It's a trend, or perhaps a lack thereof, to be honest. This shows the distribution between foreign and domestic originated operations that we have enforced against since 2017. And when I say a domestic operation, what I mean is an operation that is targeting public debate within the same country from which it is being operated. And what's interesting about this is that in 2018 and 2019, I think much of the public discussion about influence operations focused on foreign interference, and in particular, state-backed foreign interference. In 2020 and now in 2021, I think a lot of that conversation has shifted to focus on domestic manipulation. But the truth is, if you look at the data here, you will see that the amount of foreign and domestic operations that we've seen around the world have been approximately consistent, going as far back as 2018. And we see that pattern continued, which just reinforces the fact that it's not that influence operations are a foreign interference problem or a domestic manipulation problem, or that one is shifting into the other. But rather, there are two distinct capacities here, and we need as a community to figure out how to tackle both of them at the same time. So let me talk a little bit about a couple of the adversarial trends that we call out in the report and that we've seen in recent years. The first is the rise of influence operations for hire companies. Now, there was actually a panel discussing this just yesterday, and someone from the team, David Agranovich, was part of that along with a number of other experts. So I won't belabor this point too much. But I do want to call out what I think are the two biggest challenges that happen as a result of this trend of PR firms or marketing firms running influence operations for hire. The first is, if you are a sophisticated threat actor, you can use this to further launder your identity. If you hire a PR firm to run a campaign for you, and you don't conduct that exchange over social media, and you conceal that reasonably well, our teams that work very hard to attribute these operations when we can do it may be able to find the PR firm, but they're unlikely to be able to get back to whoever hired them. You're going to need law enforcement capacity or government investigations or some other tool to make that second leap. And so IO for hire firms are making it easier for people to hide who they are when they run these campaigns. And then second, they're democratizing access to these techniques. You no longer need to train a team in how to run an influence operation. You just need to hire someone. And that has a trickle-down effect across the sort of sphere of threat actors in the threat landscape. There are more and more less sophisticated actors getting into the game because they can make a hire like this. And I think that raises additional challenges. There are things that can be done to deter this community. But as was talked about yesterday on the panel, I think what's most important is we have to make this business unappealing and unprofitable. The second trend that I want to mention is platform diversification. It is more true than ever today that influence operations don't just target one social media platform. They target multiple platforms. They increasingly leverage websites on the open internet. They directly target traditional media, and they often or sometimes include off-platform physical world components. All these pieces together create an interesting challenge for investigators because you need to be able to piece together what's happening across different platforms to understand the scope of an operation. This is one of the reasons why the work of the digital Sherlocks and the community here is so important. We need to have that cross-platform analysis and analytics to understand the scope of the challenges we face. In some ways, this is a good sign because platform diversification is being driven in part by increased enforcement at the major social media platforms. The more sophisticated threat actors, whether we're talking about Russian-linked actors or Iranian-linked actors, their operations are getting caught earlier, they're getting caught sooner. And so they're moving off of the major platforms to look for other places where they can persist longer. And so it's good to see that, but it does mean they are looking for other ways to run these operations. They are targeting newer social media platforms that either haven't invested yet in these security systems or are built themselves as a more open platform that isn't going to take that kind of action. And I think that is a challenge that's going to come back for us again and again in the months and the years ahead. And then the third trend that I would mention is perception hacking. And what I mean by that is as influence operations are getting caught sooner and sooner, we're seeing threat actors shift. Rather than running an influence operation, they are simply preying on the fact that the public believes these influence operations are out there and are all around. And so if you think about, for example, the Iranian-linked operation that we saw ahead of the 2020 elections just now, where Iranian actors in the final days of the vote impersonated the Proud Boys, a far-right white supremacist organization in the United States, and through email actually threatened voters, suggesting that they had broken into the voting systems and knew who'd voted for whom and that they were going to be in trouble if they voted for the wrong candidate. There's no evidence that they accessed any sensitive information. There's no suggestion that any voting databases were compromised. They didn't have any particular access. All they were doing was preying on the fear that people have that this might happen. Now, that campaign wasn't as effective as I would expect the actors would have wanted it to be, because government, civil society, industry, and media came together to debunk that quite quickly. But one of the real lessons is if you're going to counter perception hacking, you have to have authentic and accurate information out there in advance to get ahead of the claim that's made. These are some trends that we've seen over the past few years, and I want to talk now about what's coming next. First, I want to mention this concept of fast twitch operations. What I mean by this is if you think about the muscles in our body, there are fast twitch and slow twitch muscles. Slow twitch muscles tend to be better on a marathon. Fast twitch muscles are more useful for a sprint. You can actually break influence operations up along this same dimension. Many of the influence operations that we think about as defenders are slow twitch operations, by which I mean an actor might spend months or even years building a network of fake assets online, making them look legitimate, getting them a following, making them more popular, and then using them to push out their narrative. If you can get away with that, that's very effective. But the problem is there's a long period of buildup before you start pushing out your narrative as you're trying to build these assets. If they get caught and removed, you've just spent a bunch of time investing in them and now they're gone. And as defenders get better at catching these operations, the cost and the risk of running slow twitch operations gets higher and higher. Fast twitch operations are very different. Instead of building up this audience, instead what you try to do is you try to inject into public debate right in the last few days or hours before a critical moment, a salacious, a false, and an exciting piece of information that's going to change the conversation. That Iranian operation I mentioned is a good example of this. And we've seen hack and leak operations that are other attempts to do this. These fast twitch operations are particularly interesting and challenging for defenders because we don't have as much time in advance to find and stop the campaign. And it's where careful, accurate information is really important to slow down the response to the false claims so that all the defenders can have time to tackle whatever threat emerges. Second, there are many new types of actors and threats involved in influence operations today. The last presentation ended by noting that the threat landscape doesn't look anything today like it did in 2017 or 2018. And that's absolutely true. I think we often think about a IRA 2016 style influence operation when we talk about this. But the truth is today, the world is much more complex. One very simple example, which connects a few of the threat trends we've been talking about. In the Mexican elections that happened just recently, we found a pretty high number of CIB campaigns, mostly linked to local or regional political actors, fairly small, fairly focused, that were all kind of getting in on the game because they were able to hire PR firms. These are a very different type of actor. They're making a different type of risk calculus, and the way you deter them is going to be different. And we have to be thinking as a community, not just how do we tackle the old type of threat, but how do we tackle these new threats that are emerging so consistently. And then the final sort of looking forward point that I want to make, one of the clearest lessons of the last few years has been that to tackle influence operations, you need a whole of society response. You need civil society, industry, the media, and government all to be conscious of this threat and to be tackling it. But one of the challenges that's emerging is if those are the four legs of the defensive stool, and when we put them together, it can actually be very effective, and we've seen that. What do you do when one of those legs isn't a defender? When one of those legs is actually perpetrating the influence operation, or is at least looking the other way? And we've seen this around the world as we see digital autocracy rise, and we see governments try to use both their official and their unofficial capacity to either push these campaigns or make it hard for defenders to counter them. And I think one of the key challenges we all need to think about is in that world, when you don't have all four of those legs of the stool, how do you still counter these operations? Now, that's a scary note to end on. So I just want to say, actually, if you look at this data set overall, the overall message is actually that we're making significant progress. We've moved from a world where you really don't see many defender teams on the field to having dedicated teams across society countering those threats. And I think there's incredible, and by and large, it looks like these operations are getting caught sooner, and they're reaching fewer people before they're getting taken down. Those are good signs, and it's reassuring that I think we can make progress when we're working on this together. I'll close just by saying I mentioned this data set that backs up the report. One of the things we're thinking about now is what can we do to make this data set more useful? What are additional types of taxonomy we could offer, the types of actors who might be linked to different campaigns, et cetera? If anyone in the audience has thoughts on this, please feel free to reach out to any of the authors. That's something I would love to hear as we continue to improve the report. And with that, I will pause and be happy to take questions. I think you're muted, Oumou.
Oh my God.
There you go.
Thank you so much to the hosts. I want to first say thank you for your presentation, and also just sort of add, I want to start off our question and answer period with a question of my own as the audience questions continue to roll in. And it's, sort of one, can you help us situate action taken against coordinated and authentic behavior and influence operations within an overall policy framework for curbing influence operations? Would you say, for example, it's a policy of first, second, or maybe last resort? And there's a part two to that question, but I'll just sort of let you attack that framing there.
Two-part questions are always the trickiest. So actually what I would say is what we're talking about here when we talk about removing these operations, I think it's very important to take these operations down as soon as they're found. And I think the ability to share them really enables better studying of this, but it has to be complemented with proactive work. So I'll take two types of proactive work. First, how do we as a community get out accurate information about the types of things we expect these operations to target to prepare the ground to make them less effective? And then second, and very specifically from a platform perspective, what can we do to change the environment of the platforms to make them more resistant to deception and more conducive to authenticity? For example, how can we put more context around posts so that people can understand who they're hearing from and can judge for themselves, so that we're getting ahead of the operations as opposed to just trying to counter them once they've emerged? And one of the feedback loops we really rely on within Facebook is whenever we conduct one of these takedowns, we observe the tactics and techniques that are being used, and then sit down with our product partners and feed lessons from that back into the product changes we're going to make over the next months to make those tactics less effective. And so over time, the goal is to force the threat actors to weaker and weaker ground, where they're essentially pushing harder for less of a result.
Thanks so much. I want to build on that first question and circle back to the part two. One of the, a lot of the conversation around influence operations is focused on specific content, and you invoked Camille Francois earlier, the ABC, as we sort of colloquially call it, framework, with the focus on specific content, individual posts, or overarching narratives. And the focus with CIB, of course, is behavior. Can you talk to us a little bit about why that is? Is there, for example, a higher preventative payoff for focusing on behavior as opposed to actor or content, to again invoke Camille Francois?
Yeah, and that's a really good question. I'll say 3 reasons why we focus on behavior over content. The first is behavior is a much more clear indicator of malicious intent. We've seen threat actors grab content from sort of unwitting users and use that content in their campaigns. And we've also seen threat actors take very clickbaity and exciting content and seed it to try to get unwitting people to reshare it. If we were to enforce purely on content, we would have to either massively under-enforce and miss a bunch of the bad operations, or we'd have to massively over-enforce and silence a bunch of innocent people that don't realize that they're being involved in this operation. And so drawing that line is the first reason why we do it. The second reason is, remember I talked about both foreign and domestic operations. One of the things that's particularly important, I think we often, when we think about content, we tend to be thinking about what we might have seen from the 2016 IRA operations. But a lot of content is even subtler than that. And if you're talking about domestic versus foreign actors, one of the most useful things is to be able to say, we enforce consistently based on behavior. It doesn't matter what you say. It doesn't matter what you believe in. It doesn't matter what argument you're making. If you use these techniques, then we will take action against you. And this is the last reason we focus on behavior versus content. Influence operations tend to focus on politically divisive issues, which means that anytime you take an enforcement action, you can expect that about half of the population in whatever country it's in is going to be aligned with at least the content of the campaign as opposed to the intent behind it, which means that you get a lot of accusations of bias or questions about whether you're playing one side or the other. And if you look globally at our enforcements, you'll see that they are from all sides of the political aisle, from a bunch of different countries all around the world. But being able to say consistently, it's about behavior, it's not about content, is one of the sort of few defenses we have to be able to consistently take these actions, particularly in domestic contexts.
Sure. And so on the point of enforcement, are there any other enforcement actions that have been effective and that coordinated and inauthentic behavior, as the term does not cover?
Other types of enforcement actions that have been effective. So I think it really depends on the type of the threat, right? Coordinated inauthentic behavior is very low volume, high consequence, driven by experts. And so the strategy is you want to raise the bar as much as possible and have an expert defense team that can keep up with and get ahead of the experts who are driving it. On the other hand, you might have something like the wholesale creation of fake accounts. This is not sophisticated and it's not driven by expertise, it's driven by volume. And for that, you need a more automated system that catches and blocks these very quickly and can stay ahead of that sort of stampede. So for fake accounts, we have automated systems that very quickly block millions of fake accounts every day. And we know that threat actors will continue to try to create them. But the interesting thing is these two things, blocking fake accounts and tackling influence operations, are actually deeply connected. Because as you make it harder and harder to run fake accounts, you catch the simple bad guys, as it were, but you also raise the bar for the more sophisticated actors. You slow them down and you give those expert investigators more time to catch them. So the trick is to think about all the different pieces and then fit them together so that they can be as effective as possible.
Thank you so much. We just had an audience question come in, and I will read it to you. You mentioned, Nathaniel, that one of Facebook's new priorities is stopping influence operations for financial reasons. Could you speak in more detail on this? Why, in your opinion, has there been an observed uptick? Do you think it has to do with misaligned incentives in the markets that Facebook has created, both via monetization and revenue opportunities offered to users or in the marketplace?
So that's a great question. I would say it's not that this is a new priority for Facebook. We've been finding and taking down these IO for hire companies for some time. If you look back at some of the earlier takedowns of Archimedes Group, Pragmatico, and some of the others, I think what's happened is influence operations, which are multi-platform, and we see them exploit a whole bunch of different platforms, have become much more publicly understood. They have become much more, quite frankly, approachable after the 2016 elections. I think one of the most challenging consequences of the influence operations around the 2016 elections is they made a whole lot of other people feel like they could use tactics like that. It's interesting because if you look at the characteristics of influence operations today, by the most sophisticated actors, they actually look more and more like what influence operations looked back in the 80s and the 90s in the last century. They are much more carefully hidden. They rely very heavily on real world legitimization techniques, and they often are pretty high risk. Like the hit rate on them is not as high. And so a good example of this is an operation run by Russian actors where they created a fake NGO that was based in Ghana, in Accra. They hired real people, unwitting people, to work for that NGO and to make it look legitimate. And the goal of that operation was, as far as we can tell, to legitimize this NGO so they could then use it to push divisive, racially charged narratives into the United States and elsewhere in the lead up to the 2020 elections. Unfortunately, that operation wasn't terribly successful because they were caught early on and they were exposed. But that operation looks a lot like, or I suppose I should say, unfortunately for them, fortunately for the rest of us, that operation looks a lot like influence operations you might have seen in the 70s or the 80s. Now, a consequence of those, though, is that I think people see them and they see the coverage of them and they understand they're happening. And so smaller actors, whether you're thinking about politicians who are running for local office, might think, hey, I should try to get me some of that. Maybe I could run an influence operation. Maybe that would be helpful. And so we're seeing more experimentation in this space. And that's why I think it's so important to very clearly demonstrate that if you try to run a business based on influence operations, Facebook is not going to be a hospitable place for you. And we will not just take down the operation, we will take down the entire business and we will not let them come back.
To add to that, just for a few more seconds or minutes, what kinds of steps would you suggest Facebook and other platforms take to increase both costs and barriers to entry for disinformation for hire work? What are some of the concrete disincentives that you've seen work effectively so far?
So certainly, if we're thinking about in the disruption space, I think there are two things that have been most effective. I do think that naming and shaming commercial firms is effective because you signal, if you can catch them early enough, for others entering the industry, that it's not going to be as long running and valuable a market as they might think it is. The second thing is when you take it down, you actually publicize the tactics they used and you share that information as widely as you can with researchers so that it's not just my team that's looking for this, but it's all of the other expert investigative teams across the Defender community. It's interesting if you look at that data set that I mentioned, about 2/3 of those cases originated from our own internal investigations, and about 1/3 originate in whole or in part from tips from outside experts, whether we're talking about law enforcement or civil society investigators or journalists. And that's by design. There are far more experts outside of any one institution than there will ever be inside of it. And there will always be people who can build expertise with particular regions or particular actors to be especially effective. And so we've worked really hard to cultivate those communities. And so I think by sharing that information and getting it so that instead of one set of eyes looking at the problem, there are 50 or 500 or 5,000, it can be particularly effective.
Thank you. One question that the research community might be particularly interested in: will Facebook make access to data more readily available so civil society can track mis and disinformation on the platform?
So one of the things we're trying to do here is do exactly that. If you take a look at the report, you can see, as I mentioned, we have a data set of all of the public takedowns. All of these takedowns are public. The analysis of them, the tactics and the behaviors we saw these actors engage in is public, and we've shared that. And this data set includes statistics around each takedown. It includes the attribution information to the extent that we had it when we conducted the takedown, and it includes links to these detailed reports. And it's also worth noting that when we conduct these takedowns, we also share information with external research groups. And for many of these takedowns, there are also in-depth analyses, some of these running to the 60, 70, 80 page mark, detailing the operation, detailing the tactics, and detailing some of the lessons learned. So in my experience, transparency about these things is extremely important. And the more that we can do, the more valuable it is. I do think one question we're grappling with is the world of influence operations looks very differently today than it did in 2018. And if you think again back to this example I mentioned of the Mexican elections, and all of these fairly small influence operations didn't reach many people. It's not clear how effective they were. should we be putting the same weight behind being transparent about those as we are about, for example, a new significant operation that uses new tactics we haven't seen before? Where I would like to see us get is a space where we can do more detailed deep dive investigations and expose information on the most sophisticated or the most innovative threats we see, and move some of the resources to focus where I think it'll be most valuable. And you've seen us start to experiment with that in some of our recent reports, and you'll see more of that going forward.
I want to pick up on that point just for a second to trace the arc of how the landscape has changed just in the last couple of years. Starting in about 2015 or 2016, there was your IRA, manipulation of accounts, a little bit of identity laundering, and then around sort of 2018 and 2019, there was a shift where we saw an uptick in all sorts of different actors, including both foreign and domestic, collaborating and working together. What are your some of reflections about how that sort of shift happens, and how do you see that informing future countering influence operation work?
So if you're thinking particularly about the sort of blurring of the line between foreign and domestic actors, I think that certainly is a trend that's worth paying attention to. And there are two ways we see it happening. Well, maybe three. One is we see foreign actors hiring locals to work for them. This is something we've seen in a number of operations targeting public debate in Africa and some others in other parts of the world. There, I think it's most driven by the desire to have someone who is an expert, not just in the local language, but the local culture, so that your messaging can land as effectively as possible. Second, we've seen efforts to use locals to kind of better hide an operation, to blur it, or make it harder for the social media platforms to find it and enforce against it. And perhaps to make it more difficult because it looks like you're enforcing against domestic citizens expressing their right to free speech. And there, I think the behavioral focus of these investigations is absolutely critical, because it allows us to be very consistent. It doesn't matter if you're foreign or domestic, to be honest. What matters is, are you running a network of fake accounts that's concealing the identity of what's behind an operation? I mean, I think it's important to remember, if we look at the 2020 elections in the United States as sort of a good instance to focus on for this type of technique, in the lead up to that, we removed about 16 operations that were targeting the elections or public debate ahead of the elections in some way. There were 5 that were linked to actors from Russia. There were 5 that were linked to actors from Iran. There was 1 linked to an actors from China, although even that wasn't particularly targeted. And then there were 5 that were domestic operations linked to individuals within the United States. And all of them were enforced based on this behavioral standard. And I think that's a really important way to tackle domestic actors in addition to foreign.
Nathaniel, let's talk about future trends just for a second, but also about the work the community can do as a whole, both individually within their own silos and collaboratively to try to move the needle on this issue set. What is your vision for the future of the countering disinformation field? You mentioned during your presentation that there are 4 legs of the stool, which include civil society, media, government, and platforms. What kind of collaborative approaches do those 4 communities need to be undertaking to move the needle on this issue set in the next 5 to 10 years?
Sure. I mean, I think it's very clear that you need each of those communities sort of pulling their different weights. Like each one has different expertise, and you need ways for them all to share information to tackle the threat actors. And then you need ways for them to hold each other accountable when they aren't sort of up to snuff, right? So if we think about that Iranian operation, a really interesting example of this, and we look at the way the different communities engaged with it, government came out very quickly to attribute, to say, look, this is who was behind this operation. Here's our proof. Here's how we know. And that's a role that government is particularly suited for because they have intelligence collection capabilities that no one else does. The social media platforms were able to move very quickly to take down any assets that were linked to that operation, which again is something that the social media platforms are best suited to do. Media, as we were initially covering it and things were just starting to come out, covered it in a way that was very thoughtful and very cautious. It was sort of like, let's learn more about this. Let's figure out what's happening. They were able to remind people to sort of take time, understand what this is, and give the experts time to conduct their analysis and their enforcement. And then civil society had a very important role as well, which is government and the social media platforms both have a trust deficit. And civil society is a really critical voice that is independent, that can say, look, we're looking at this too. here's what we see. We think that these assertions, that this analysis is legitimate, and we think it's worth trusting. They are authentic voices, and they're authoritative voices that aren't from either of these sort of bigger players. And so in terms of what I would like to see happen going forward, I think that each of these communities need to continue to play these different roles. And as I mentioned in the talk, I think one of the real challenges we face is seeing more and more IO happen in places in the world where governments may not be on the side of countering this. They might be behind it. When you don't have that investigative role, that anchoring role that government can play to expose this, then you have a real challenge. How do you replicate that elsewhere? And how do you deal with it if a government is going to use its authority to put pressure on platforms, to put pressure on civil society, to put pressure on defenders across the community to not expose these things, to not enforce against them? I think that poses real challenges, and the entire community needs to think about how do we deal with that challenge. And one of the most important points, I guess I'll actually add here, is democratic governments and democratic communities can put pressure on more autocratic governments that are using these techniques to signal that there are lines here and that public debate is important and needs to be defended, and constrain their ability to impose pressure themselves.
Would you say this sort of whole society approach between these four sectors is a necessary condition for moving the needle? If, for instance, there are episodes we have where civil society is not able to carry the torch the way that we would hope they should, or another actor group, what sorts of balancing is needed in those cases when each group is not able to collaborate as optimally as we'd like?
Yeah, I don't know that it's a necessary condition. It's very important, but you can look, for example, at communities like in Myanmar, where the government itself and the military has been behind a number of these operations. And there have been a number of steps driven by a combination of platform enforcement and civil society investigation that have really constrained these operations. So I think there are things that we can do, and there are things that different pieces of the community can do if you don't have everyone together. I just think as far as the challenge goes, it's the fewer legs of that stool you have, the harder the problem is going to be. And that's particularly true as we see influence operators more and more try to bypass the major social media platforms and either create prominent websites, directly target journalists, which is a tactic we increasingly see these actors using, or go to other social media platforms that aren't as equipped or interested in doing this type of enforcement. Right now, I think we rely heavily on the ability of the major social media platforms to enforce and constrain these actors. As we push them away from that and they move to other places where we don't have as much direct enforcement capacity, I do think that's going to pose an interesting challenge.
We have about 1 minute left, but I want to get in an audience question. This person says, studying cybersecurity, I was amazed at how much I didn't know about the nature of data itself. When developing new generations of people entering your field, do you find that people find unexpected value as they experience granular and related data?
The shortest answer to that is yes. I think there's no substitute for being able to access and study the data itself and understand what's happening. I do think one of the interesting challenges in the influence operations space is we're still very early in understanding what influence operations in the social media world look like, and it's changing under our feet. And so there are a lot of non-experts that look at data very quickly and draw extremely salacious conclusions that when experts dig in, it turns out they're not supported. And so I think one of the really interesting questions is how do we get expertise and anchored knowledge to help us draw analysis as we're dealing with these challenges. I think if you look at some of the work that's happening at the Carnegie Endowment, at the Partnership to Counter Influence Operations, at some of the work at the Atlantic Council, I think we really need to build up that academic expertise to help us get ahead of these challenges.
Nathaniel, thank you so much. Very informative presentation. Thank you for your time. Turning it back over to you, Graham.
And actually back over to Rose in the studio.
We're just going to keep passing it. But I want to say thank you to Oumou and Nathaniel as we bring day 3 of 360 OS to a close. Let us also say thank you to all of our excellent panelists and speakers for joining us, and to all of you watching for making this possible.
We started today with a poignant address from Hong Kong activist in exile, Nathan Law. And we heard from a panel of activists and journalists about the evolution of digitally enabled movements in the region, and it served as a stark reminder of the human stakes in this conversation.
We also heard today from international elections experts about disinformation and coming elections, as well as a fascinating chat between leading public health expert Dr. Ashish Jha and disinformation scholar Renee DiResta about COVID-19 misinformation and the infodemic.
If you missed any of them, make sure to check out all of the series of excellent lightning talks from this afternoon, covering everything from the gaming industry to human rights and AR and VR in tech, China's suppression of public information, as well as a human rights approach to child protection online.
And we've got just one more day left, and it's shaping up to be a great one. So please do join us tomorrow to see renowned journalist Maria Ressa, Kenyan scholar Nanjala Nyabola, and former Wikimedia CEO Catherine Marr in conversation with Erica Kochi about the global digital square.
And we've got more lightning talks from leading scholars on the evolution of propaganda and disinformation, an address from the Danish tech ambassador, and a fireside chat with Congressman Tom Malinowski to close it all out. The conversation, as always, will continue for us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, as well as everywhere where you're engaged with this conference. So please, engaging there, tagging our @DFR Lab and @Atlantic Council handles, and using hashtag 360OS.
We look forward to seeing you all tomorrow. Thank you.